We're about to start part 2 of the Fairlane engine swap update. It wasn't intended to be more than one video, so I did have to chop them up for time. But let's go ahead and get into it with where we left off.
Okay, so I did do my research, and for this particular year, the 302 and the 351 did have the same off balance at 28 ounce. 1981, the 302 went to a 50 ounce. So everything should work between the two of them. And what I'm going to check now is verifying I am on top dead center of the compression stroke. So not only am I not a tech guru, I am not an artist either. But to kind of show you what we're looking for, there's 4 main cycles to an ignition system, or to a 4-stroke engine, let me say. You've got your ignition, your compression, or excuse me, your intake, your compression, your ignition, your exhaust. A lot of times you'll hear like an old timer say, suck, squeeze, bang, blow. So what that is you've got your piston and you've got your valves. For now, we're just going to do a 2-valve system, not 4, not blah, 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 blah. So you've got your intake valve and your exhaust valve, and you've got the piston that moves up and down. So for the intake stroke, the piston's going to move down, your intake valve opens and allows your fuel air mixture to come in. During the compression, both valves are closed, and the piston's going to run up and it's going to take all this and compress it into a highly volatile mixture. The ignition, both valves are closed, the spark plug goes off, creates an explosion, and forces the piston down. For the next one, the piston comes back up, the exhaust valve opens, and all the burnt comes out, and then it cycles through. So when you're running an RPM, say 1,000 RPM, you're doing this 1,000 times a minute, 1,000 revolutions a minute. So this happens super, super, super fast. That's why your ignition points are so important. So you've got your crankshaft. This is on a classic engine. You've got your crankshaft, you've got your camshaft, and those are connected by a chain. And that's going to be what controls your valve timing in relation to the piston. So when they talk about degreeing a cam, this is going to look like a bicycle chain, and all these are going to have cogs on them. And what's going to happen is, depending on where your center line of your crank is, you're going to degree, if you want to get super exact, you're going to degree your cam if you've got that kind of gear. Most of your base level aftermarket upgrades don't give you adjustable. You're just going to what they call straight up. So your indicators are going to be like that, and it's going to control where your camshaft is, where those lobes are, when those valves open. So that's going to be that timing. The next time you're going to have is going to be your ignition timing. So when does the spark plug fire in relation to this sequence? And when they talk about retarding or advanced, what they're talking about is when that spark happens in relation to top dead center. So if you're 15 degrees retarded, you're actually going to start your spark before you're actually all the way compressed. So what that does, it gives because all this happens so fast, it gives that spark time to actually ignite that mixture. If you wait until you're completely compressed, then by the time your ignition happens, you've already got an exhaust valve open. So having the electrical timing and the physical timing are both super important. So when you're adjusting where your distributor says rotates this way, you're adjusting when it happens here. So if we come back over to the car, what I'm looking at now on Ford, this is the #1 piston. And if we take a look to where our stuff is lined up at, here's your intake runner, here's your exhaust. Let me point it where you can see it. Here's your intake runner, and here's your exhaust. So if I'm looking at it that way, this is going to be my intake valve, this is going to be my exhaust valve. So I want both of these closed at the same time, but are they closed at the same time at top dead center, at bottom dead center, or anywhere between those two particular strokes? So what we do, I'm going to take that spark plug back out again, and I'm going to run something into the cylinder that's going to let me know when I'm at the top of that stroke. And I want to be at the top of the stroke with both of these closed. That way I know I'm at the top of the compression stroke. And the way that you do that is what they call barring it over. You just get the tool on here. That's what I left on just a moment ago. And I'm going to rotate the engine around until I see these valves open and then close. You'll be able to take that cycle. So what I'm going to be looking for is when the when the intake valve closes. So it's going to open up for the intake, run down, and then it's going to close, and then the piston is going to come back up. Be nice if I do this once in a while, actually, on camera. So what I'm going to wait for this is for the only time this valve opens is on the intake stroke. And again, that's going to allow your fuel mixture in. So I'm going to wait for this to open and then close. Then once that closes, I'm going to put something in here. They make special tools for it. You can do it with a zip tie. You can do it with anything you can get in there, basically just to be able to see what that piston is doing. So once this is closed and this piston comes all the way up and starts to come back down, that's when you know you're kind of in that degree of top dead center. From there, I can take a look at my timing pointer and see how close my timing pointer is. Again, if everything were accurate, that's typically going to be your timing pointer. And that's going to let you know when you're at top dead center. Now on this one, again, if I want to set this correctly with a base timing that's without any advancement on it, so your base timing, you want to be, on this one, between 15 and 17 retarded, the engine is going to spin clockwise. So if this is supposed to be my top dead center, then I actually want my spark to hit right about here. Now this one is not set up. A lot of them will set up with degrees, so you know exactly where you're at. This one does not, but I do have, if I can find it, I do have a tape that I can clean this up, put the tape on, and set my zero. But again, I want to ensure that that's correct. If that isn't, and where I made that other mark is correct, that's where I want to base my ignition timing off of. So I'm going to run through that real quick, see how much of it I can capture on video. I don't have the best setup at the moment, and all my assistants are otherwise occupied. So we'll see how much that I can show you that I'm actually doing, but just kind of do base walkthrough. That's what I'm trying to do, is establish when is my top dead center, find out where my mark is, and find out where my ignition timing is in relation to all that. So if you have compression, you have fuel, and you have ignition, you should run. It may not run well if you've got something else out, but those are the three things you need to run. So I'm going to spin through and see what I can find. Alright, so here's my exhaust valve opening. Now it's closing. Now my intake valve should open. Now a lot of times what you can do is put your finger in the hole if you've got clear access to it, and you can actually feel when the air is coming out. And that'll give you an idea when you're close. There's the intake valve closing. I don't know if you can hear on camera, but just got a little bit of whoosh. All right, now that should be pretty dang close. The air escaping has stopped. If I come down here, I'm going to back up again just a little bit. And my 1/4 inch extension here is showing that I am going back down. All right, so go forward again. So we're starting to come back down again, come back a little. Now you do have just a little bit of time at the top of that stroke that's called dwell. And essentially what that is, when the piston's going up and down, you've got the crankshaft spinning around, you're gonna have just a little bit of time that crankshaft is gonna spin before it pulls it back down. So you've got just a brief moment where that crank is moving, but the piston really isn't. So again, depending on what you're building, this is a daily driver, not a race engine. So I'm not getting that specific with it, but we're kind of right in that dwell time. So I was able to check the motion of the piston. I'm in that dwell at top dead center. Both of my valves are closed, so that is going to be the compression stroke. So we are going to check and see where I'm at with the distributor timing. See, I should be pointing to the number 1 spark plug wire, which in my adjusted cap is going to be this one here. So I'll see where I'm at there and see how close I am to being lined up and what needs to change. There. There we go. Take 72. So I've double checked my ignition timing. It's where it needs to be. I've had a little bit of time with the charger, probably not as much as I should. So we will see. All right, so what we will check now, everything else is working. I'm gonna get some more time on the battery, get that charge up some more. What I need to take a look at now is ensuring that I actually have spark when I was supposed to have it. And the way that I do that is basically have somebody crank it over while I hold the spark plug up to something metal, see if I can see it spark. If not, there's an adjustment inside the distributor that I need to make to get that spark a little bit stronger, or possibly change the coil if there's an issue with the coil. So a little more testing. So the two things I need to look at, took a little time off, had some supper, watched a movie with the family, back on the car. So you've got the ignition coil here, which everything worked when I pulled the car apart, so I don't think that's the issue, but I'm going to do a resistance test on that. And I'll be taking a look at within the distributor. Now this originally had a point style setup, which is a little bit different. I did do a Protronix electronic ignition conversion. And one of the things that you need to do is have that gap set correctly in order to pass the spark along. So what happens is you come through, the coil gets energized, comes through, hits the top of the cap, and then as the rotor, try this again. So the coil gets energized, comes through, goes into the cap, comes down to the rotor button, and then as the rotor spins around, it hits the contact points inside the cap, and that's what takes your spark out to all your cylinders. So if that gap isn't correct, then it's not going to pass the spark correctly. If this thing isn't energizing, then it's not going to pass the spark to the cap. So fuel electronic things to check. Again, everything else seems to be working the way that it should. So it's going to be something electric, which is not allowing it to spark. In this particular instance, timing doesn't matter, because even if you're out of time, you're still going to show spark at the spark plug. It may not spark when you want it to, but it will still show a spark. I tested a little bit earlier, pulled the plug out, and what you're looking is some type of zap coming between the point and the electrode, and I wasn't getting anything, which means there's nothing actually coming there. So could be something really simple. Again, I know that coil worked when I took my other engine apart. I'm unsure about the condition of the distributor, although that system was in the 302 distributor. It's not the same distributor because it's a different depth between the 302 and the 351. So I don't know if the distributor had worked before, but with new guts in it, I know the guts had worked. So I'm gonna keep looking and see what I can figure out as far as sending the pulse. All right, so the first thing I checked, other than making sure that all my wiring was correct as far as powering up the coil, there's a primary and a secondary side of the coil. So primary is going to be between these two, and secondary is going to be between the center. So when you're checking the resistance, if you have a multimeter, you want to see anywhere between about 0.4 and about 2-ish resistance on these guys, and about 1.6, 1.7. And then from here to here, you want to see between 6 and 20, and I was right about 10. So I know my coil is good, it's doing what it needs to do. So again, making sure that it's actually powering up with the ignition, because if that's not powering up and being activated, then it's not kicking the signal over. Once I do that, making sure it's not something with my ignition that has failed. Once I verify that that is correct and this is correct, then I get into the distributor itself. And again, the only thing electrical on that is fairly new with that optronics unit, so I'm doubting it's that. But I was in the parts industry for a long time, and unfortunately, new does not always mean good. Parts fail, that's why they have warranties. So marking on down the list. So that guy's doing what it needs to do. As long as that's getting energized, then we're looking at the distributor and going from there. So here it is a few days later. I've been digging around a little bit more. Apparently been under a little bit of stress. I just got a little more gray in the beard than I remember from before. But I've kind of researched everything, and I'm going to let you know what I found. A few minutes here, a few minutes there. I've been dealing with some shoulder issues. I had some doctor's appointments and stuff where really trying not to have surgery, but I've been having issues with my right shoulder, and hopefully that's not going to slow me up too much. But let's go through and see what I found. So again, we've been dealing with the ignition system. I know the starter works. We were able to get that spinning over. Everything cranked just fine. I know that side of the electrical was fine, but not getting anything out of the coil. So I went through and I pulled apart the ignition switch, which on this one is easy enough because it's up on the dash, not in the column. Got it right there. I've got to finish putting that back together again. Went through all the wiring to try and figure out. This particular one is super simple. There's no specific ignition box. So the ignition switch energizes the starter solenoid. The starter solenoid passes power everywhere else it needs to go. It comes in through this harness here, which goes up into the firewall, passes through. We've got the coolant temp sensor. This wire here goes all the way down to the oil pressure sensor right there, and it comes through to the positive side of the coil, which should power up the coil. Negative and positive here goes to run the distributor. When I hook my tach back up, I will have another lead there to power the tach. That's it. So as far as electronics goes, it's a very simple system. Drove me nuts. Now, one thing I will say, always go back to basics. Start at the beginning, work your way out. A lot of times it's going to be something stupid. So as we follow this back, step around my pile of junk here. So this is the harness that comes through. So I need to trace this harness through and figure out where it's supposed to be getting power from. And right here we see a quick disconnect. Guess what I found after 4 days of digging and probing and trying to figure out? This thing was disconnected. So when I was looking originally, let me get this popped out quick. So this thing was sitting back kind of behind the master, and this end of it was laying down kind of mixed in with the spark plugs. And at one point I had noticed that this thing was empty, but for some reason in my hurry I thought it had more to do with the wiper motor, even though you can clearly see the wiper motor is connected. So I came back through, did some digging around, and sure enough, that lead was disconnected. Gee, I wonder why I don't have any spark. So once we hook that back together, let's see what happens. So I am going to use just a little bit of spray. I have not had time to prime the fuel pump yet, so I don't have any fuel in the carb. And I just don't want to sit there and crank and crank and crank and crank with a brand new flat tappet in there. I don't want to run the chance of hurting that lobe. But for the time being, put a little happy juice in there. We have a live engine now. So part 2 showed a little bit of diagnostic, one big bonehead move, and the importance of going back to the basics, going back to simple when things aren't quite going your way. So we had a little bit of discovery there, did show how to diagnose some parts, especially electrical, which is not my strong point. I'm definitely not a bolt guy. I'm not real big on electrical. But, you know, we've got where we needed to be, and we wrapped up part 2. Part 3 will show the not quite completion, but we've got far enough to where the Fairlane will technically drive. So we will wrap that up in part 3. Again, as I end every video, I do appreciate those that take the time to watch these. Feel free to give a like, give a subscribe, leave any kind of comments underneath, you know, what you liked, what you didn't, recommendations for future episodes, anything at all, any general automotive questions you'd like me to address that maybe you feel like you're not getting a straight answer elsewhere. So I will definitely answer what I can. But again, I appreciate it, and we'll see you guys next time.